and thank you for joining me for another SpouseLink live stream. These are designed for military spouses who are thinking about military retirement, experiencing military retirement right now, or have crossed into retirement and are living a civilian life. So, just before we get started, I'd love for anyone that's watching to jump on, tell me where you're joining us from. I'd love to hear what part of the world you're living in. And then as we continue with our live stream, feel free to comment and share your thoughts as we go along. This is supposed to be interactive. We want to hear what you have to say, and we really value what you have to say about these topics. So, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm Anna Larson. I'm a copywriter and digital marketer. I'm a homeschool mom, and I'm a retired military spouse as of 6 months ago. So this past year, when my soldier retired from active duty service, that was a really difficult transition for our family. And that struggle led me to SpouseLink and to AFMA, where now I get to support military spouses who are going through that same retirement and transition. And, and I get to help them have better resources, more information, and a community of support through SpouseLink. So today we are going to be inviting on Jennifer Pasquale. So I want to just really quick tell you a little bit about Jennifer before I bring her on. So Jennifer is, let me pull up her bio right here. She is a 15-year active duty Army and proud red leg spouse, mom of two, and dog mom. She's a champion for the seasoned military spouse, which is why I have Jen on with us today. She founded Pride and Grit in 2018 as a website resource hub, social media community, and as of this year, an annual retreat for spouses looking for honest dialogue and community around topics like identity, marriage, and designing the life you want after the military. Through her efforts, Jen hopes to inspire seasoned spouses to share their experiences and tell their stories, both the highs and the low points, so that we can all grow stronger together. So, without further ado, I'm going to bring Jennifer on. Hi,
Jen. Hello, Anna.
How are you doing?
I'm good. It's great to get to hang out with you today. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, it is great to get to hang out with you today too. And I was so excited when you agreed to come on because last year this past year when you did your very first retreat, I wasn't able to attend. We were just right at the beginning of getting ready to move, and it was one of those crazy time frames. But the feedback I heard from people afterwards was amazing. Like everybody absolutely loved it. And so when I was like, I wonder if Jen would be willing to share like lessons learned from that retreat.
Of course.
And now here we are doing it, right?
Look at this.
Okay. So, all right. So let me just ask you, like the very first question I kind of have is, can you just tell me, why did you decide to even have a retreat for seasoned military spouses? Like, what was your motivation behind doing that?
Yeah, so that was, it was really the end of sort of a journey of sorts. When I had first started Pride and Grit, that was not part of the plan. It was not, in my, long-term intent for the Pride and Grit community. But it kind of just evolved after talking to a lot of people about, where they were, what was working, what was hard. Really, like creating Pride and Grit was about creating a space for those honest, hard conversations that sometimes I felt like weren't happening. And particularly what I started to realize is that I had this passion around my own community of seasoned spouses, folks who'd kind of been around the military block a while and were often kind of, they were often not sharing what was hard because they felt like, oh, I've done this for so long. This is supposed to be easy for me, or I'm supposed to kind of have it all together. And yet they really still needed support. And so I started to realize, wait a minute, there's a need in this pocket within the larger military community for folks who really are staring down transition or staring down retirement, or even on the other side of it, but don't necessarily feel like they, have the support they need to really talk about the things that are hard with that kind of cumulative service that comes over a decade or two, of being alongside your service member. So the retreat really was just born out of all those conversations. And then I had done a survey in the fall of 2019, just saying, hey, like, here's some topics I think would be great to talk about. what do y'all think? And I got some amazing feedback that really helped us shape the event into something that folks wanted and hit
Yeah.
on the topics that were like kind of the ones they were struggling with the most.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that, I mean, we've been part of my family has been part of the military for quite some time. And before you had done that, there really was nothing that I'd ever seen for the seasoned spouse specifically. I mean, there's a lot of stuff for new spouses coming in, like learning the ropes, figuring out military life just in general, making it through those deployments, those first TDYs and separations from your spouse, dealing with all the things and PCS moves. And granted, seasoned spouses still have to do all of those things also. But there is a different, I mean, we call it seasons for a reason, right? Like there is just a different level once you've been in the military for a minute. There's a different level of understanding and need, I think, for different things. So I love that you put that together. I think that, well, like I said, I heard nothing but positive things. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you today about what those 10 lessons were, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and these are lessons from the retreat. And they're also just lessons that I've learned as I've listened to what people are struggling with after really that lengthy service and what I often call kind of this compounding impact. It's not the first PCS or the second or the third, but it's like the 9th and the 10th and the 11th. And at some point there is this fatigue that sets in. And sometimes there's not a space to talk about that fatigue with people who are in the same space. Right. So
yeah, because you're supposed to be okay with it by this time, right? You're supposed to
no.
know how to deal with it and do it, right? It's just kind of like, oh, you've done this 5 times, you got this. But okay, so before we get started, I do want to ask anyone who's listening right now, just are you having conversations about military retirement right now with your spouse? I'm really curious. Drop your answers in the comments. Kind of want to see where the people listening, like where they're at in terms of like, are they talking about this stuff already? Do they think, oh, I've got 3 or 4 years, I don't have to worry about it right now? So that's kind of going to play into what Jen and I end up discussing today. All right, so you kind of categorized your top 10 list into 2 different parts. The first category was kind of when you're nearing retirement, you don't necessarily have a date, but you know that DD 214 is in the future, like not so far out, but you're getting that you're going that direction. You know it's on. You know you're getting there. And then the second 5 were you've got a date, you're transition focused, you know this is happening in the next year, maybe year and a half time frame. Your spouse's packets getting put together, maybe going through the approval process, right? And you're like, we are doing this. Like this is happening now, right? So based on your experience with seasoned spouses, like when would you say it's time to start having conversations about this?
I mean, I think you will be hard pressed to find anyone who says they started too early. Like that's just, it's like not a thing, right? Really, it's never too early to start talking about what that might look like for your family or, what are some of the things you're concerned about. So I think it's really never too early to start talking about that. But I think for a lot of people, like for us, it was, we've been talking about it for a while and we're not even necessarily at that retirement stage, but we've been talking about, well, when do we want to stabilize the kids? Where do we think we might want to live? Do we want to live near your family or my family? Like those are all questions we've been having for several years now. So I think, it's different for everyone, but certainly a few years out, if you're not starting to talk about what that plan might look like, then it's probably time to at least start throwing some things out and just create some conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could see, if you saw all those comments coming in from people that are listening right now, like the general consensus is all the time, do it now, start now, don't wait, those kinds of things. So like you said, hard pressed to find anyone that's going to be like, wait till you're like 3 months before it goes, Yeah, no big deal. It's no big deal. So, all right, let's talk about number 1, the very first strength that we have. I'm going to pull up our little banner here. All right, the very first one. Jen, why don't you tell us what it is?
So for seasoned spouses, one of the things is just really knowing your strengths. So this, was a key part of the retreat that we did. We had Corey Weathers come in, who's amazing, and really walk us through the Clifton Strengths Finder assessment. And that is really just a 34 type assessment where it'll tell you like, these are the things you are, that are strong for you, that are easy for you. These are the things at the bottom of the list that are harder for you and maybe take more of your energy. And so I think for the retreat and for attendees, it was really helpful to just kind of look at themselves a little differently and understand what, kind of what they're all about, right? What are the things that they excel at? So you can really lean into those things. And so I think where it comes into play with this, with the topic is, I think, what I learned when I did mine is I realized, okay, these are the things I can really bring to the table as we're trying to, whenever that time comes, when we're ready to start mapping out exactly what things look like, these are the things I can bring to the table. These are my strengths. These are the things I'm not good at. So I'm going to, to my husband, right? These are where I need you to be good at these. And it just so happens, not surprisingly, like he and I are sort of like opposites, right? He's good at the things at the bottom of my list. And I'm definitely, probably good at some of the things are at the bottom of his. So the pairing works well for sure. But I think the strengths is important. It's part of identity. It's part of just sort of knowing who you are. And I think that gives you the tools and the information to have really informed conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've taken the Clifton Strength Finder with a different thing that I had done. So would you be willing to share what was one of your strengths and like how would you say it's going to help you through the transition process?
Well, like I am a complete sort of fan of strength, so much so that I actually just yesterday signed up to become a coach, and like now I'm going to pursue that because I just love it so much. And the reason I love it is because I've done so many different assessments, but for me, like my top strength as an example is what's called relator. And so as a relator, what that often means when it's sort of used as a force for good, it means that I'm really good at finding blind spots. I'm really good at kind of seeing the second and third order effects of decisions. But when I don't harness it well, it means I also overthink. It means I can kind of find problems where there aren't problems. And so knowing that about myself, it really gave me the ability to like observe myself differently. And, similarly, knowing what was at the bottom of my list kind of gave me like the grace to go, oh, okay, that's why I've never found that easy. I'm not. And so that like, for me, that was it was almost as important to know what was at the bottom because it gave me like the permission to go, oh, I'm not supposed to be good at those things, right? We can't all be good at everything. And so for me, it was huge to just be like, you know what? I'm not going to build those as strengths. I'm going to focus on really growing those things that come easier and are just I'm naturally strong at, and I can leverage those a whole lot easier. And so that became a different kind of focus for me. So that I'm a huge fan.
I love that. And I would love to hear from people that are listening right now, like, what is the strength that you have that you think is going to serve you well through transition, whether it's a Clifton Strength Finder or whether it's a different personality test you've taken, or whether it's just something that you know about yourself. Like, drop it in the comments. Like, what is it that you are currently like really good at that you think is going to serve you well? Very curious. All right, we're going to move on to question. Well, not question. It's really like strength number 2 or lesson learned number 2, which is ask the questions. And this one made me very curious. I was like, well, there's so many questions. Like, what questions are you talking about here?
Well, I think when folks are approaching what is this really significant thing, right? Transition or retirement, like those are significant changes in life. And I think particularly going back to what we said before, if you're a seasoned spouse, if you've been kind of around the block a while, sometimes it's easy to feel like, oh, I think I'm supposed to know that, or I'm supposed to know where to go, or I'm supposed to, fill in the blank. And so I think it's really just kind of taking all of those expectations off and saying, I'm going to ask all the questions, every question. I'm going to make sure that I, understand as much as I possibly can about the process, about, how it's going to be for my service member, how it's going to be for our family, talking to other people. I think it's really just giving yourself the permission to not have any answers because you've never done this before, right? It's like parenting, right? We've never done that before. If we never asked anything about it or never tried to educate ourselves on it, it probably wouldn't go very well, right? We have to learn.
Yes.
And sometimes we have to learn by, maybe making a mistake or two, right? But I think, this process is the same. It's not always going to go smoothly. but just continue to ask the questions, continue to dial in. And I think that's why it's one of the tips that is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to throw in like personal experience here because this really, what you just said really resonates with me. I thought I already knew how I would feel, and I thought I already knew how it would go. Like in my head, I was like, I've PCS, I've gone through deployments, I've moved all over the world. I got this down. I know how to do this. And I didn't ask questions, and I didn't stop and like reflect on like what might not go as planned, because we always have plans A through Z in our back pocket, right? So I thought I knew, and I didn't ask the questions. So I'm going to say this is so important. Like for anyone listening right now, this is so important, like to realize that even if you think you know the answer, reach out and ask and just make sure, because everyone's experience is just a little bit different. And what you may have heard from your besties that have told you all about their retirement experience might not apply to you, and it might not work the same way for you. So I love that. Okay. All right. Lesson learned number. I keep calling them strengths, right? But these are like strengths of the seasoned spouse. So like if I mess that up again, we're just going to run with it.
Fine.
So the third lesson learned was consider your identity. And 2 weeks ago, I had a live stream where we talked specifically about this with Annie Brock from the Leader Transition Institute, and really kind of like, the fact that there are people that feel very comfortable with their identity. They don't identify with the military spouse side of things as strongly. This is really kind of more for, like, in my opinion, the people that feel strongly about loving being a military spouse, and that designation, that active duty designation, changes things for them. I fell into that category. I love being a military spouse. It's one of the things I say about myself when I introduce myself to people. And I was very surprised at the loss I felt when we transitioned. So can you just talk to us a little bit more about this one in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think Annie did a great job with this last week, because I think it's a really, really understated impact for people in this experience. And so I think it is one of those things where talking about how soon should you be doing things, like this is one that I think is really important to do early, because I think for military spouses, if you do have any portion of your identity kind of wrapped up in this service, then there is going to be a shift that happens. And so, to your point, for some people, maybe that's not the case. Maybe they've, maintained their career and have kind of stayed on a different track. And so for them, maybe this won't be as big of a deal. But for a lot of people, and I think particularly some of it has to do with kind of the evolution, right? If you've been around for 15 or 20 years, you've been through kind of what service has looked like for the last 15 or 20 years. Sometimes it hits people a little bit differently. But I think it's just taking that minute to go, okay, do I feel like I have solid footing around who I am, what I want, what I want, not, what I think my service member is going to do after the military service, but what do I personally want to do? Because now I may have them home all the time, and I may be able to make different choices. And so what do I want those choices to look like? And just to like think about it. I think personal development is really important as part of this process. And I think Annie spoke to that last week as well. And I think identity is the topic that was key in that survey that I mentioned. When I did the survey, I asked, how much do you want to talk about identity? And it was like, yes, please. Like everybody wanted to talk about that, because, even if they didn't feel completely lost, there were just aspects of it that they knew it would never be time that wasn't well spent to just consider what life's going to look like for them as they can make different choices.
Yeah. And I would say, like, I mean, it's like you're speaking directly to me in my experience, right? Like I shocked myself by how sad I was. And what surprised me probably the most is that I felt like I suddenly was lacking the ability to give value back to the military community. You're not active duty anymore. Your value is gone. And that was a surprising feeling, because I have a profession and a career totally separate from the military, and have my spouse's entire military career. So I felt like I had a strong identity outside of the military. So despite appreciating and enjoying being a military spouse. So this shocked me, really shocked me. And it actually ties in perfectly for the very next lesson
Segue.
learned, right? I know, like that was like the nicest little smooth transition we're going through. But the next one is be ready to grieve. Oh my gosh. I mean, that's just what we were just talking about, that
Mhm.
depth of sadness that I felt that was totally shocked. And I'm curious for anyone listening, if you're nearing transition, are you feeling this already? Is this something you're starting, or, are you anticipating having grief, I guess, or sadness, sorrow over this transition? I'm curious to see what people who are listening say about that. But while we're waiting for their comments, Jen, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the grief process and
Mhm.
maybe anything that you would recommend that they do to help cope with some of that sorrow that comes with this transition?
Well, so this was a topic that was rolled into some of the other conversations that were happening during the retreat, and I think that, the takeaway for me from those conversations is just to kind of create the space for that, right? Anticipate that might be what how your story is written, and be
Yeah.
willing to just sort of lean into that and not resist that, and know that it's okay for you. It's certainly okay for your service member, because I think it's as we are going through that process as a family of really pivoting away from military. It's not just us that might be grieving. It's really about our service member and what their identity shift is looking like, and how they may be handling that. So just knowing that can be a part of it, and that's totally normal. And
Yes.
I think we just have to kind of give ourselves sort of permission to lean into that feeling, and know that it's okay, and know that there are people that have been down that road, and they've felt those same things, and you just have to kind of work through it. And I think be patient with yourself. But I think it helps to know. I think exactly what you said. I've heard from a lot of people that they were surprised by it. As much as they thought they knew it would happen, they were surprised when it happened, how it happened, what it happened about.
Yeah.
Because we know grief is not linear, right? So it ebbs and flows, and so just kind of knowing that this month these things might not bother you, and then maybe next month something else happens, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm really missing that, and I'm really kind of sad about that.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah, I do want to just remind everyone. I mean, my sob story, like my literal like breaking point was the on post library. Like how silly is that, right? It's like the most ridiculous thing to like fall apart over, but it was like the one thing too many in that list of changes that had
Mhm.
occurred that made me go, I can't do this anymore.
Mhm.
Like I'm freaking out. So,
Like it's always that way, right? It's like when we say it's okay to not be okay, it's usually not this huge thing that made us like realize we weren't okay. Sometimes it's this really small thing that we go, oh gosh, okay, I'm not handling this as well as I thought I was. And so now what do I need to do to help myself kind of move through it in
yeah,
a more productive way. But
yeah.
sometimes you just gotta like have the cry and feel the feels, and then get to the other side.
Yes, and I love this comment by Paloma, right? Like her grief is because she's listening to these jets and none of them are flown by her husband. Like that is something that you are probably aren't thinking about right
Mhm.
now if you're just starting the retirement and transition time frame. But it is something that I mean that she's feeling now, that and she's thinking, that's not
Mhm.
us anymore, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, that's so good. Thank you
Yeah,
for
great
sharing.
comment.
Yeah. Okay. So the last of the five, and remember, we categorize these kind of like these are conversations and topics and things that you should really be thinking about. Like, you joined the military, guess what? Start talking about this kind of thing. Like, you got 10 years in, you're going to retire at some point. These are conversations you should be having.
Yeah, no,
So
for sure.
the last of the five for that category was find your community. So, where should military spouses be looking for this, right? Because we're kind of have built in community when we are living on or near a military base. But when the retirement and transition process happens, then what? Where's your
Mhm.
community go?
Well, and I think, when it comes to, being in this group of people that, have the form in hand and are really starting to walk down, the path that is on the other side of service, this is a hard one. This is another one that I think really catches people off guard as to how much, they might miss it. And so I think really it's also about defining what that looks like for you. So if you're someone who really is like, we did our time, and now as a family we're moving in a different direction, and you really want to walk away from that, like, that's fine. Know that. But it's really, I think, about being honest with yourself about what is it that really you enjoy, what is it you really want out of the next chapter, and then design your community to fit that, right? So if you really are ready to just walk from military life, then surround yourself with a community that's not necessarily in military circles, right? And if you really feel like you are someone who's going to really miss that connection, then get involved with military-based organizations. There's so many people that is how they stay connected to the community. Is kind of, Anna, exactly what you're doing, right? You're staying connected to the community by doing this service. And so I think it's really about understanding who you are, what you want. I think that's what helps you find your people, because you're going to have to kind of do that again and do that a little bit differently. And sometimes it means you move to a new place. So, that final PCS to, or what you hope is at least the final PCS to, the post-retirement location. You're having to start over, but now you're having to start over without all that built-in infrastructure. And that I think can be really kind of overwhelming for someone who's like, not like you, but is going to a place where there's not a base and there's not that feel of kind of the military population. So I think you just have to know what you need. And then you just have to put the time in. And I'm an introvert myself. And so that's hard for me. It is not it is not easy for me to find my circle again when we relocate. It takes me a long time. But I know I just have to keep doing it one step at a time and be patient with it. And I just have to keep doing something to help me build that new community.
Yeah. And I would even say for people staying around a military base to keep in mind that when your active duty status goes, there are now suddenly activities, events, and organizations that are no longer serving you. You're no longer qualifying for what you from this day to this day, now you're eligible, now you're not. And so if you are still associating a lot with active duty spouses that are attending these kinds of things, then you don't get to go anymore. Just prepare yourself for those kinds of things. That active duty eligibility makes a difference in some of the things that are available to you. But that's kind of that's like a lesson learned for me from the past 6 months.
I think this tip and the ask questions tip go together, right? Because if you're not finding your community, then ask, right? There are definitely veterans in your area. You just have to connect with them and then find out, how are they staying connected if that's really what you're seeking, but you're not sure how to do it.
Yeah, and I will say it's not as easy as it sounds, because we've been now retired for 6 months and I'm still like, where are they hiding? Like, really, like, or maybe it's just me and they just don't say anymore, oh, we're retired military, right? Unless you specifically ask them and they've moved past that point of identifying as military or not military. They're just, I'm Jen or I'm Anna.
I actually part of me thinks there is this evolution, and I don't have anything to base this on, but this is just my own opinion, that there's sort of this evolution happening where it felt like for the longest time there wasn't really the idea that military retirement or military transition was sort of a team sport or a family affair, right? It was really just the service member does it, the service member gets the services, and as they should, right? But I think what we're starting to see is that in order for a service member to transition well, the whole family has to transition well, right? It's all connected. And so when that service member has a family that's able to transition well and be supported and have the access to resources and information, then the whole unit can move forward, I think, more a little more easily than maybe we'd had in the past. So I'd be interested to fast forward 5 years and see, to your point, do some of these sort of groups kind of pop up, kind of like what Pride and Grit is trying to do, right? These groups that try to be a resource and a community for people who are in this space. There just hasn't been that demand before, but clearly there is a demand for it, because just like you said, it doesn't really exist, or at least it's not widely available. And yet people, I think, would tap into it and are interested in it.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. Like, my entire experience is based on that for our family to go through this transition, for it to have been a better experience, there should have been little parts and pieces that the whole family experienced together. As a we 100% focus on getting my soldier out, and he needed that. Like that had to happen, right? But the whole point of kind of this live stream and some of the others that we're doing really is that spouses and children need the support as well. So exactly, I feel like we could hit in live, and you just made that's it. That's what we came here to say today. But yes, I 100% agree. All right, let's go to our next 5 topics. Those are fantastic lessons learned. These next 5 are like, if you have your DD214 date, if you know that retirement date, you need to be having these conversations. The next 5 lessons learned that we have. So the very first one is define your season of life. Jen, can you just tell me what you mean by this?
Yeah, and honestly, I honestly think these 5 could go at any point, right? So not necessarily waiting until that moment, but if you haven't done it by then, for sure, think about it. But this one also came out of the retreat, which is we had an amazing speaker, Dr. Patrice Carter, who came and talked to us about identity, and her talk was really about equating the season of life that you're in with sort of the seasons of the year. So what she talked about is the idea that, spring is this time when we're growing and we're flourishing and we're, kind of expanding. And, you can contrast it, say, with winter or fall, where, we're maybe pulling a little more into our own and we're not necessarily, approaching things in the same way. And so what she talked about is just knowing what season you're in. Like, are you feeling like you are in a season where you really do want to grow and you want to invest in like maybe your own development, or are you really, in a completely different season? So it's really about knowing it, honoring it, and trusting that you're not going to stay there forever. Like if you're not in a season of spring and of growth and of newness, then that's okay. You will get there. Just, honor the season that you're in and make sure you're aware of it so that you can kind of be tuned into, okay, well, maybe I've been in fall a little, maybe I've been in winter a little too long, right? I've been kind of holding into myself for a little too long and I need to do some different things. So that was kind of the premise of this tip, which was just a great message within the retreat.
Yeah. And I would say, just for anyone listening, that first of all, I'm curious, what season of life do you feel like you're in right now? And then the second is that there's not a right or wrong for the military transition timeframe. You can be in a season of growth, or you can be in a season of kind of more inward reflection. Neither of those is right or wrong. One's not going to be better for you necessarily than the other. And so like you said, Jen, like just honor where you're at, be okay with it. Like understand that this is what you need in this time, and that eventually you'll move out of it. So I love that tip. I think that's really important. And honestly, you can change seasons like every other week. I'm telling you. Because occasionally during the transition, I'd have like this burst of energy, and then I'm like, okay, I can't do this anymore. This is too much, right? So, okay. All right. So the next lesson learned is to be emotionally elastic. Okay. So I loved this because really now, if military spouses are not the epitome of this, I don't know who is, right?
Right.
Our lives are in constant states of change. But what do you define emotional elasticity as, and why is it so important during the retirement time frame?
So one of the topics we had at the retreat was around marriage and transition. And so Dr. Shauna Springer had come and talked to us about what that looks like and how to really, how to approach that as a couple and approach, the process as a team. And one of the topics she also brought up is this emotional elasticity. So I am one who, after 15 years, really 17 years total, right, being in this space, I have this very kind of negative knee-jerk reaction to the word resilience, because I just have had a hard time. I have seen for myself where my own imposed expectation around my own resilience kept me from asking for help, talking to people about things that were hard, that were going on in our lives. And so over time, I've really kind of like shied away from that, because I think sometimes that term can keep people from feeling like it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to
Yeah.
say this is hard, because you know what? It is. Um, it doesn't mean you do it any differently. It wouldn't doesn't mean you trade it. It just means it's hard, right? Both things can be true at the same time. So being emotionally elastic is really just looking at it as more of an ebb and flow, right? The idea that it's not linear. It's not, this pillar of strength. It is really this, roller coaster that we're all going to ride emotionally, where sometimes it's great and sometimes it's going to be hard, and we're going to kind of ebb and flow through that. But the biggest thing is really surrounding ourselves with people who can kind of hold the lines for us and help us, weather that. And I think that's the piece that I wasn't doing, because I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to be the person who needed help, because I was like the old person in the room, right? I
Yeah.
think,
Right.
it's understanding that everybody needs help at any point on any journey, and that is okay. And so just really, really, really being okay with being emotionally elastic, and knowing that you're
Yeah.
going to need to be through the transition, through retirement, through carving out a new path for you and your family. Like, that's going to require some elasticity for sure.
Yeah, I feel like this elasticity kind of applies to almost every single one of the lessons learned we've been talking about, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it applies to the grief, it applies to the asking questions, it applies to the identity portion of it, it applies to finding a community. I mean, all of those things are kind of tied in together with like the way that your emotions are going to ebb and flow as you transition through each one of those separate little categories that we've been talking about. So I love this. We'll start a movement. No more resilience.
I know that people who
Emotional
love
elasticity.
there's so many folks who love resilience. It just hasn't worked for me. It really held me back, because I bought into that narrative, right? That I had to be strong, and strong meant silent. And I realized, no, strong does not mean silent. Strong means honoring where I'm
Yes.
at and what I need. And that's how I'm strong.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. All right. Um, the next lesson learned, I really love this one. Too. I mean, I loved all of them, but some of them really spoke to me more than others, right? So invest in communication. And what I loved about this is the word invest, right? It implies so much more than, hey, just talk about things.
Mhm.
Like invest really is like something much bigger than that. So talk to us a little bit about what investing in communication would mean for a retiring couple.
I think that, to me, this is the reason I use the word invest, is because I think it's important to be deliberate. It's important to be, thoughtful, in what you're trying to accomplish. And so, what in the conversations I've had with seasoned spouses and through the retreat, one of the things that we talked about, or we have talked about, is just the idea that communication is so critical to navigating that experience well. And so if you are in a place where you feel like maybe your communication as a couple is not quite where it needs to be, and maybe you don't feel like you really can, talk about your needs, or can talk about, what you're scared about, or what you're worried about. If you don't have that open communication, the time to develop it is not at the line of transition, right? Like, that's going to make it harder. And
Yes.
so part of what we talk about within the retreat is just the idea that, and it's the reason I wanted people to come that weren't at transition yet, because I really felt strongly, if we can kind of invest in ourselves, in our communication, in our marriages, well before we get to transition, then we can approach that as a much stronger team, as a much stronger
Yes.
couple. And so it's really just, spending that time figuring out what is it we need to do better to communicate well about this really hard thing that's going to happen in our family, and how can we start to lay some of that groundwork now, early, so that when we get to that line, like, we're maybe never going to be perfect at it, right? I don't think anybody's a perfect communicator, but at
Yeah.
least we'll have developed some skills that will serve us during those hard times and for those hard conversations.
Yeah. I'm just going to say right now publicly that I am the better communicator. So I'm just, between my spouse and I. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But I do really feel like that's kind of like a mic drop. Like people need to, not people, but military spouses, if you're getting ready to go through this, just if you don't know this already, TDYs, deployments, long work hours, the military lifestyle is not a recipe for great communication. It's just not, and it makes it extra hard. And so this is one of those things that even the military talks about a lot, right? Like all those resiliency programs. I mean, one of their main points is you have to be having conversations. You have to be a good communicator. You have to be talking to your spouses. And I really feel like this is one of those areas where we just are like, whatever, it'll get better when he's not deployed or she's not deployed. It'll get better when, after retirement, we'll be fine then because we won't have to deal with all this other stuff. As a 6-month retiree, let me tell you, it is not that way. There's a whole other set of things that crop up that you're not expecting that you have to be a good communicator about. So love that. Okay, so this next one I do not love. It was my least favorite part of retirement, but I'm going to throw it out there because it's important. Plan out your finances. So we're going to be doing a series about retirement finances in December with SpouseLink, and kind of be talking about some of what that might include. But for the lessons learned for a seasoned spouse, tell us what you mean by plan out your finances.
I mean, I think this is just this, in some ways, this hits all the others too, right? Communicating well, knowing what you want. I think it's really just the idea that this is also not something we want to start at the transition line. This is something we want to do early and talk about early and figure out what is the plan? What is it that we want life to look like in terms of, most people, I think, aren't necessarily going to retire and put their feet up and that's the end of it, right? So there's still a career, there's still work, there's still, other things that are coming. And so understanding what's your goal? What do you want it to look like when you're 60? What do you want it to look like when you're 65? What do we want as a couple that's going to impact how we transition? And it's going to impact the decisions we make leading up to those in the years prior to retirement. So it's really about just not waiting on those conversations, because I think that's when you get caught off guard and you realize, oh, wow, we really didn't, we didn't save enough, or we didn't do this enough, or, you hate to have sort of, I wish we had, when you get to that point when there's all these other stresses, adding financial stress to that equation is not ideal. So having a plan, knowing what the plan is and being able to just execute that plan, I think is a great, it's hard. It's just not as easy as it sounds, but it is a great way to minimize the stress created around finances during an already stressful time.
Yeah. And as a reminder, like especially if you just look on LinkedIn and look at some of these military focused like employment places where they talk about the high rate of service members who start a job immediately after their transition. And within 1 year, they are moving on to something else because they jump into this thing and then they have to do it again. So this financial portion of it really is like this roller coaster of ups and downs, and you can't count on that first job as being the job. That first series of paychecks that come in afterwards might go away again because your service member's unhappy or not dealing with their work that well, or needed something different or something more, and they just don't know because they spent the last 20 years in the military, right? So love that. Okay. The last of our 10 lessons learned. I can't believe we're at the end, but we are. So, okay. The last of the 10 is acknowledge your kids' roots. This one really hit home for me. This is not something we did really well in our transition as far as like including our children in the process. So can you talk to us a little bit about what this means and how military spouses can act on this lesson?
Yeah, this was a really interesting one that was in our survey. So when we did the survey, one of the things that came up that surprised me was the number of people who said they really needed and wanted some support around how to help their kids through the transition. I honestly had barely considered it before it became kind of a top tier item for, our future agenda for the event. So at the event, we had Lisa Howard from the Barry Robinson Center was able to join us. And what I loved about her talk is she highlighted something that I hadn't thought about, which is I had kind of prey to the narrative that, our kids have moved so much. And, I think we just finished our 9th move. So, our kids have moved. They're only 12 and 14. They've moved a lot in those 9 years. or in those 9 moves, right? And so I always felt like, oh, they don't have roots, they're not from anywhere, all the kind of the things that we know are happening. And Lisa's point that I thought was really important is just the idea that there is a way to build roots. You just have to focus on it a little bit differently. So she gave the example of, focusing on creating traditions that your family can carry from duty station to duty station, things that are in some ways shallower roots, and shallow in the sense that maybe they don't have the depth that we think of when we think of being raised in a community and being raised in the same house your whole life. That's a depth of root we can't give our kids. But what we can give them is a shallower version of that, where we have, whether it's traditions or just things that we do as a family that are consistent and are routine and are part of our military life, no matter where we go. I mean, there's so much richness in military tradition, and that, follows in too. So like our kids have been raised around that and have seen the importance of that. And so it's not the kind of route that most of us think about, but her point was just, don't discount the positive impact that some of those experiences and exposures that you've been able to give your kids through this life, what those positive things have done for them. So no, they may not have grown up in the same house, but they've been all over the world, and they've been able to carry these family traditions from house to house to house. And so they have those memories in 9 locations instead of just in 1. And so it's really about framing it differently. And I found that really helpful, as someone who hadn't really thought much about it yet. Anna? Okay.
you there? Can you hear us? Hi. I'm so sorry. So I'm from Texas. I apologize. Acknowledge your kids' roots. We will do a follow-up post closing out this live stream. Thank you for everyone. I'm so sorry about the drop and the time. Jen, thank you for being on here with us and being part of this stream. Okay.
I don't know if it's just me, Anna, but I don't think we can hear you. But thank you all for being here. It was my pleasure. Happy to talk transition anytime.